So recently, a lot of people have been saying that Israel is not our greatest ally, that giving them tens of billions of dollars in weapons hasn't provided any direct benefit to the United States and its taxpayer. And in fact, it's gotten the US involved in a bunch of pointless wars and earned the eternal hatred of every Muslim country. But that's just not the case. Israel is our greatest ally. Israel has done more militarily to help the US than Canada, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom combined in the 20th century. And people just never talk about their contributions. And I think it's time that we do talk about their contributions and we celebrate how Israel has always been there. Whenever the chips are down, whenever the US is in a big conflict, Israel is always there to help them out. So we're going to go back to World War II. So during World War II, as we all know, National Socialist Germany had completed the nuclear weapons program. They had a plant that could produce like 5 nuclear warheads a month, and they were going to use it to hit the Allied troops that had landed at D-Day. So they'd blow up the Allied troops, all the vehicles, the mulberries, the mobile harbors. The Germans had nuclear weapons and they were going to launch them using V2s. And what happened was Irgun and similar Jewish militant groups, who would later go on to be the beginnings of the IDF, were able to sabotage. They blew up the nuclear power plant. It's a nuclear reactor that was producing the things. See, the Germans had actually built that under Warsaw, and the Jewish resistance fighters rose up and they destroyed it, and they were able to destroy the nuclear weapons that were on their way to D-Day, also the nuclear weapons that were going to be used against Zhukov's army and prevent the final offensive towards Berlin. So the Allies would have lost World War II if it hadn't have been for proto-Israel. I think that's something that a lot of people overlook. And I think that alone kind of justifies the support for Israel. Next, we have the Korean War. Israel had been founded at that point in time, and Israel was a big part of the coalition. They contributed a lot of soldiers to that. So if we look at the number, Korea, of course, contributed 600,000. America contributed 326,000. And then we have Britain, Canada, and Turkey, which each contributed a couple thousand. Now, I don't know if there's just some anti-Semites who messed around with this thing on Wikipedia, but we all know the IDF provided about, 100,000 soldiers to the whole crisis. See, when the chips were down, when MacArthur was invading the North and then got boxed in and isolated, the IDF did a amphibious assault in southern China, which caused the Chinese to have to pull their forces back and prevent them from completely overrunning the Allied positions. So the Korean War ended in a stalemate solely because of the efforts of the IDF in landing there. And then later on in the war, they invaded parts of eastern China. They occupied large portions of it, including Shanghai. And they defeated a Chinese invasion force that was about to take Taiwan. And there's a bunch of other stuff they did. They were fighting on the front lines the whole time. They were the third largest contributor to the Korean War after the Americans and Koreans, of course. So then we get into the Vietnam War, which is another big incident in which Israeli intervention led to victory for the anti-communist forces. So as you all know, the Viet Cong were primarily being supplied by a trail through Cambodia, And Israel had joined the war on America's side, and they sent in paratroopers, and they were able to completely cut off the supply lines that were going into southern Vietnam. A bunch of IDF commandos came in. They blew up all the, well, I guess it wasn't rail. They blew up all the footpaths. They blew up all the supply trucks and supply trains and stuff. And they were able to end North Vietnamese support for South Vietnam, providing tens of thousands of soldiers and a large portion of the Allied Air Force. So why the Tet Offensive happened was because Israel cut off all the supplies coming in from northern Vietnam. And in an act of desperation, the North Vietnamese ordered the remaining Viet Cong to launch an offensive. And the Tet Offensive could have been a disaster, but once again, the IDF showed up. Saigon almost fell. Most of the large cities were almost overrun, but IDF intervention was able to prevent that from happening. As we all know, the South Vietnamese army did nothing. After America, Israel did the second most in the Vietnam War. And they were able to win the Vietnam War, and Vietnam is now unified under the Republic of Vietnam. And it almost became a communist country, but Israel stepped in to save it. We had the invasion of Grenada, another big victory for the Israeli-U.S. forces. The Soviets, once again, this is a revisionist history thing. The Soviet Union was going to send in a bunch of nuclear submarines and destroy the east coast of the United States. But the Israeli Air Force was able to use depth charges to destroy the Soviet submarines and prevent them from destroying the east coast of the United States. They also sent in commandos. Grenada had a very sophisticated network of SAM systems, but the IDF commandos were able to go in and completely disable it. So it would have turned into a nuclear holocaust if it hadn't have been for Israel. In that case, we have the invasion of Panama, which they also took part in. And then we had the Gulf War, which one of the primary reasons that took place was to shore up our greatest ally. And Israel was a very important part of that coalition. They provided a majority of the ground forces for the Allied powers. They were responsible for cutting off the Iraqi forces in sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a minute. In Kuwait, and not many people know this, but the Highway of Death was actually caused by IDF tank battalions. You see, America was actually losing the Gulf War. Saddam had invaded Saudi Arabia prior to the U.S. being ready, and it was only because of rapid response IDF units that the whole thing didn't turn into a complete strategic disaster. Not a lot of people know about that contribution. We had the Somalian intervention. That was the whole Black Hawk Down incident. Once again, a team of IDF commandos were the ones who saved the downed American chopper and got them out of that. We had the Yugoslav wars. That was another big part in which the IDF played a really major role. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Serbia was able to get a bunch of nuclear weapons from Belarus and Ukraine, and they were going to use them to blow up Kosovo. But there was an IDF airstrike that came in and stopped the nuclear weapons from being used. Once again, a lot of people just kind of ignore and gloss over this stuff. A lot of people kind of get away with it. There was the war in Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda was mostly destroyed by a series of precision airstrikes by the IDF. Once again, they provided the second most number of ground forces and much of the Air Force. And their precision airstrikes and ground forces allowed Afghanistan to be swiftly occupied. Al-Qaeda was driven out. It was a team of Israeli commandos that ultimately killed Osama bin Laden. And once again, that would have turned into a disaster that would have gone on for decades. without Israeli intervention. We had the Iraq War. That's another big Israeli victory. Israel was able to invade alongside the U.S., and they single-handedly defeated the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They defeated the various Sunni Shia militias. They drove out all Iranian influence. And Iraq is now a flourishing democracy because of Israeli intervention. Let's see here. They were involved in Libya. They were the ones who killed Muammar Gaddafi. They stopped the second Libyan Civil War. That was another one. Let's see. Then there was the intervention in Syria, in which, as we all know, the Israeli IDF was the mortal enemy of ISIS. ISIS constantly talked about how they wanted to destroy Israel and constantly attacked Israel to the detriment of all their other operations. They didn't go after Christians for some reason. They didn't attack the Syrian government. All their energy was focused on Israel. And Israel really came through for us in the whole Syrian Civil War. They succeeded in destroying ISIS. They also succeeded in destroying the Syrian government, which was allied with Iran, and Iran was allied with ISIS. A lot of people think that the Sunni and Shias don't get along with each other, and that Iran is a counterbalance or something to Saudi Arabia and the various Sunni jihadi groups. But that's not the case. The case is they were working together, and Israel helped us to defeat both of them. And Israel continues to have the largest ground presence of any of the Western powers or the anti-ISIS powers in Syria. So I just kind of wanted to go through this, and I wanted to talk about it. If you tally up all the military spending Israel has spent to help us out over the years, it far outweighs the amount of money and aid that we've sent to Israel. Israel's done more, like I said, in every war the U.S. has been involved in than Canada, Britain, Italy, and France combined. And that's why we have to support them in this, because how is the U.S. going to fight future wars without the IDF? I don't even know how it's possible, but that's just the reality of the situation. I mean, I don't know what kind of historical revisionism. Probably there's like some Holocaust deniers out there who will say that Israel wasn't involved in Vietnam or Korea or pretty much any other major war of the 20th century. And I don't know. They're our greatest ally. They are indeed our greatest ally.